For a girl like Charlotte, living in a small town in Maine in the mid-1800s, it was never enough. She was beautiful, the prettiest girl in town. Everyone said so. She had a trim figure, long blonde curls, bright blue eyes, and she was rich. Her parents had come to the country as poor immigrants, but through a good deal of hard work and a good deal of luck, they had prospered in shipping and manufacturing. And they spared no expense in lavishing everything on their only child. But as I said, it was not enough for Charlotte. So when she heard that the governor, who lived not far away, about 15 miles away in another town, he was planning a grand ball for New Year's Eve, she was excited. This was her chance. And so she immediately began planning everything she would need to make an impression. The first thing, of course, was the dress. And here she knew exactly what she wanted. She went immediately to the finest dressmaker in town to secure her services, which meant a couple of things. First, that Charlotte would have the services of the best dressmaker in town, and second, none of the other girls would. Well, she knew just the sort of dress she wanted. It was something from the fashion papers from Paris. And she knew the fabric that she wanted, too, blue silk, to match the blue of her eyes. She told the seamstress that she wanted the dress to rustle deliciously as she danced. The seamstress said that it would be very expensive, but Charlotte just waved her hand. No problem. Well, with the dress taken care of, she turned her attention to the next most important thing on the list, which was the escort. And here again, as with the dress, the most important thing was the looks. Charlotte told her mother that when she and her date entered the ballroom, she wanted every head to turn. She wanted their eyes to open wide. She wanted to hear an audible gasp. And so it was obvious who she needed to have as her escort. It was Charlie. He was very handsome, dark curly hair, a dazzling smile. He was tall, not overly bright, but could be very charming. And so she began flirting with him outrageously. And after only a couple of weeks, he asked her to accompany him to the ball. If she'd kept it up, he probably would have asked her to marry him, but that wasn't her goal, so she toned it down a little. So now she had the dress and the escort, and she began taking care, one by one, of all the other things on her list. The shoes, the hair, the jewelry, everything was to be just exactly the way she wanted it. There was only one thing that she couldn't control, and that worried her. It was the weather. Well, it was winter in Maine, and winters in Maine were always cold, but this was the coldest, snowiest winter that anyone could ever remember. Even the old people who'd lived there for years and years said that they had never remembered the snow coming so early and being so deep and so cold. In fact, there was talk that the ball might be canceled. That worried Charlotte, but it wasn't, so that was good. When the night of the big ball came, Charlie came to the door. Charlotte swept down the circular stairs, and she could see by the look on Charlie's face that all of her efforts had been worth it. The dress had turned out even better than she'd expected. The skirt was just layer after layer after layer of ruffles, and not just gathered ruffles, but pleated ruffles. It had taken their maid the entire day to press those ruffles in with an iron that she heated on a stove all day. The neckline plunged daringly, and it was lined with ruffles as well. When Charlotte got to the bottom of the stairs, she took Charlie's hand and said, "Let's go." Charlotte's father said, "Take care of my little girl, young man." And Charlie said, "Of course, sir." And Charlotte's mother held out a long, heavy wool coat and said, "Don't forget your coat, Charlotte." And she laughed dismissively. "Oh, Mother, I don't want to wear that coat. Why, if I wore that coat, it would crumple my dress. I'd just look like a dish rag when we got to the ball. Besides, I have my silk shawl. I'm sure that will be enough, and it's not that far." In fact, it was a good 15 miles. But before her parents could say anything else, Charlotte and Charlie swept out the door. Now, waiting for them was their method of transportation for the evening. It was not a coach, it was not even a carriage, but it was a one-horse open sleigh. Well, Charlie helped Charlotte over to her side of the seat, and then he went over and got up on his. He gave the reins a shake, and they were off. They traveled about 5 miles, and Charlie reached behind the seat and pulled out a blanket. He said, I know you didn't want to wear a coat, but at least wrap this around you. It's very warm. I take this blanket hunting all the time. And Charlotte said, oh, no, I didn't want a coat, and I certainly won't wrap that old hunting blanket around me. But it is cold. Could we go faster? So he shook the reins again, and they went faster. But after they'd gone about another 5 miles, he reached under the seat and pulled out a lap robe. It was buffalo hide, and it still had the buffalo fur on it. Well, at least put this around you. No, that shaggy old thing? No, in any case, I think I'm feeling warmer now. Well, they traveled the rest of the way and finally came to the governor's mansion. It was a big, beautiful place, almost a palace. And there was music and light streaming out all of the windows. Charlie stopped, ran around to Charlotte's side of the sleigh and held up his hand, and he said, Charlotte, I can hardly wait to get inside. Take my hand. But she didn't move, and she didn't speak. Come on, Charlotte. It's cold out here. Take my hand. But she didn't move, and she didn't speak. Come on, Charlotte. He reached up and grasped her hand, but even through his thick gloves, he could feel that her hand was cold, very cold, and stiff. He scooped her up in his arms and ran into the ballroom. And as he entered with Charlotte in his arms, every head turned, their eyes opened wide, and there was an audible gasp. Exactly what she'd wanted, but not exactly in the way she'd wanted it. Well, they set Charlotte down and tried to revive her, but it was no use. She was dead, frozen to death. And now there was nothing for Charlie to do but to take her back to her parents' home. He put her back in the sleigh, wrapped in the hunting blanket and the buffalo robe, though now they could do her no good. When he brought the lifeless form of Charlotte into her parents' house, her mother screamed and fainted. She never did regain consciousness, and she died 2 days later. And her father, having lost his wife and his only child in the space of only a couple of days, he lost heart completely. He sold his house, he sold his business, and he went west. No one ever heard from him again. But it wasn't only Charlotte's father that was on the move west, because the story of Frozen Charlotte appeared in the local newspaper, and it gained enough attention that it was reprinted in several other newspapers around the state and beyond. And then a poet, Seba Smith, he wrote a long narrative poem telling the story. And then that poem was put to music. And so the story and the poem and the song, they traveled west with pioneers. But there was one other thing that traveled west about Frozen Charlotte. And that was a doll. Of course, children have always had dolls, but the most popular doll in the mid-1800s, all the way across the United States, was a doll that became known as a Frozen Charlotte. Here's one. The dolls were imported by the thousands, mostly from china factories in Germany. They were from about 1 inch to maybe 4 or 5 inches tall. And they were made of porcelain, white and smooth and cool to the touch. Little girls had many of them. They were often called penny dolls because they were very inexpensive. And girls would take them and dress them up in scraps of lace or ribbon or cloth. And often as they played with those dolls, they would tell the story about poor Charlotte, fair Charlotte, frozen Charlotte, who had frozen to death on her way to a ball. And often when they told the story, they shivered and whispered about the fate of poor Charlotte. Of course, their parents never discouraged this play or this story, because after all, the point of the story was that if she had only listened to her mother, she wouldn't have frozen to death. So, the frozen Charlotte doll. But there was one other thing that became attached to the story of frozen Charlotte, and that was a dessert known as frozen Charlotte. It was made with lady fingers and whipped cream and sugar and fruit, and it was rich and fancy, just the thing to serve at an important occasion, like a ball. And like the real Charlotte, it was rich and fancy. But unlike the real Charlotte, those who knew the real Charlotte said that she was not all that sweet.